Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LPL Winners Finals Lower Bracket Round 4 overview and analysis video in the LPL Summer Split Playoffs. Very excited to get into it. We've got some interesting series to cover. One of our first teams to qualify for Worlds will be determined here today, and I'm really excited to see how that will end up here in the LPL. Of course, one team will be eliminated by the end of this video as well in 4th place, certainly setting up the regional qualifier just a tad bit more. We're going to know a lot about the future of the LPL by the end of this. Only 3 teams will remain, and I'm excited to see who they will be. If you are excited as well, let me know down in the comments section below. Check out the video up in the iCard right now as well if you were interested in my analysis of round number 4, the round that we just got, the upper bracket that determined where these teams went in these matchups in particular. If you want to hear me preview them, the matchups that we got this series, you can check out the end of that video, but of course you can also check out the playlist in the iCard, and that's going to be every single LPL video that we have made over the course of this split. So if you're interested in that stuff, please check it out. If you want to know how I got to the opinions that I'm at the current moment, that is a very good place to start, but certainly not required viewing, because today we're going to be going over everything that happened in the past few days. Winners Finals, that lower bracket round 4 series as we talked about. I'm excited. Hope you guys are as well, but let's jump right into it. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go game by game in both of the series. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game in each game that we cover. Then at the end of each series, I will be giving a player of the series to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We'll, of course, also be talking about our semifinals that I will be covering tomorrow on this channel at the end of the video, kind of previewing what you can expect from that series, whether or not I think it might be interesting or whether or not I think it might be a bit of a blowout. I think a bunch of different options are available depending on what happens here today. So, without further ado, let's jump right into the analysis. Our first series that we're going to cover in today's video is the big one. It is Winners Finals, the top 2 teams pretty unquestionably right now in the LPL. It's the number 1 seeded Bilibili Gaming taking on the number 3 seeded Top Esports. And, you know, I said unquestionably the top 2, even though Top Esports is the number 3 seed. That's because they very easily handled the number 2 seed LNG in the previous round. Not only that, but they were white hot coming into the playoffs. As we talked about, they had lost 2 series over the course of this regular season. They started the regular season, or at least the group Ascend, 0-2, coming off of their really deep Esports World Cup berth. They had to play like 3 days after that, like 2 days in a row with 2 series against LNG and Bilibili Gaming, and, you know, it was just a really tough way to stack their schedule. After that really rough, you know, essential, like, return to the country, they were untouchable. Not only did they not lose a single series the rest of the regular season, they didn't lose a single game the rest of the regular season after those first 2 series losses, and so you're really looking at this team in a really positive light. They've been dominant over the course of this playoff run, only losing 1 game to anyone's legend in the 3rd round, and so you have a lot of confidence in Top Esports, but it's not like you don't have confidence in a team like Bilibili Gaming, who have been the LPL team over the course of 2024. On paper, they are the strongest roster for sure. It's just really hard to top a team that has been Knight, Elk, and On. And even with Wei coming in and certainly being a bit of a question mark at the start, he has lived up to every single expectation you could possibly give him. He has genuinely been one of the best junglers in the league ever since joining Bilibili Gaming. It's completely changed their style. They have slowed down, quote-unquote, a bit, or at least they did in the regular season, but you go and watch their series against Weibo Gaming. They're very happy to play very aggro and aggressive and try to push that tempo, and that's something that would make them basically unbeatable. Really, the only flaw that I had in their game plan in the regular season was the fact that they were relying a lot on 5v5 team fights when Wei came in. They weren't quite pushing the tempo in the same way that Shun was doing when he was the jungler, and so I was concerned that if a team, like, actually tried to compete with them early on in games, like, would they be able to, like, out-skirmish those situations, or is Wei, like, actively going to make them more of a one-dimensional type of team, even if that dimension is very good? That's not the case. They are not one-dimensional at all. They proved that against Weibo Gaming, who did try to test them in the early game. So credit to Bilibili. They look relatively untouchable right now. As for the matchups in this series, it's really up in the air. I'm really excited to see these 2 bot lanes go head-to-head. For my money, these are the 2 best bot lanes in the world right now in terms of performances, like in terms of what they're able to do on the Rift, and I think I'm really interested to see if one can, like, just generally outplay the other. I think that's going to be a big turning point in a series like this. You have the MVP and Tian taking on Wei, who's kind of been a reigniter for BLG. You have Knight versus Cream, who's been hyper consistent, but is pretty untested in such high water in the playoffs here, and Knight, who is kind of the king of the LPL right now, and then Bin versus 369, maybe our most interesting top lane matchup we have in the entire league, maybe the entire world. And so a very exciting series between two of the more dominant teams. One of them is going to be going to finals, and that means one of them will be guaranteeing their spot at Worlds. It would guarantee that either of these teams would make it at the very least as the number 2 seed in terms of how the championship points end up working out. And so really excited to see how that ends up going. But the only way to know who wins this series is to go game by game and to see who ends up taking it. So let's kick it off with game number 1. The winner of game number 1 was Top Esports. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and this is a very big way to establish pressure early on in this series, to be able to go toe-to-toe with BLG and really just kind of outplay them in a lot of key situations is very big. BLG goes for a very risky, very aggressive draft with a Diana Yasuo mid-jungle duo, and they really want to play off this Wombo combo, off the Rel, the Ashe Arrow, then the Diana Engage, try to set up Knight on this Yasuo to be able to take over some of these fights, but it really didn't end up working out for them. There was really no way for the Diana to get in and stay in on anyone. On Top Esports, she just folded instantly. She had no resistances and she was not able to survive anything. And so you land in these situations where the Diana actually is kind of a hindrance towards the team overall. Even with Wei trying to play aggressive, it just didn't end up working out. And on the flip side, Top Esports was in the right place at the right time, doing the right thing basically every single time they needed to be. The top side of this map was excellent. The bot lane was excellent in this game. You really just want to give a shout out to all 5 members of Top Esports. Player of the game was very difficult in that regard because I think you could point to quite a few members being the quote-unquote carries and the most important players for the team. In this game, I'm going to land on Tian being player of the game because of the early game. He just completely ran the first 10 minutes and was really able to establish pressure, obviously, for the bot lane very early on. He got his own bit of gold down there with a double kill in a 3v2, essentially, for Top Esports, but also really being able to impact a lot of the fights on the top side of the map. You had that big, skirmish exchange that ended up with 369 landing a double kill as well. That was basically entirely set up by Tian. So you feel really good about how he is playing at the current moment. I have continued to sing his praises over the course of this year. There have been times where I've been low on Tian, 2022 in particular, but ever since then, last year I was a big defender of him, and this year I was a massive defender of him. I think he is amazing. He deserved his MVP, even if I personally would have given it to Elk. In my opinion, he was number 2 for me. He was very high up there. He's been the best jungler in the LPL, and he continues to prove that. Cream is the other player that I think you definitely wanted to consider for player of the game here, just because of how good he was on the Corki. It was really fun to watch him just kind of blow up a lot of these situations, and especially in these late fights, that champion does a ridiculous amount of damage if he can be in a good spot. If Tian and Mako and 369 are setting up a lot of these plays, yeah, he's going to be able to take advantage of that and basically just shoot down the entirety of BLG, outdamage every single one of them combined. 369 was amazing in this game. I honestly considered giving him player of the game just because of how good he was on the Cassante. Uncatchable. That champion is really unpunishable when you are very far ahead like he was, and he was able to get ahead because of some really good skirmish fighting in the early game, and that's all on 369. A lot of the positioning and the damage that he was able to do was him being good at this champion as a player and not so much the champion being broken as we often see with Cassante. Jackie Love and Mako were good as well. I think Mako was definitely a lot more influential, a lot of very fast engages. He was not afraid to play aggressive in this game. And again, it just goes back to Top Esports mentality of not being afraid to try and outskill their opponents. Oftentimes, they are just going to be better than the people that they're playing against. And if they can do that against a team like BLG, yeah, you best believe I believe in them to do that against anybody in the world. And so this was a great performance and a great first win for Top Esports in this series. But for BLG, going down 0-1, it's not ideal. It's certainly not good to be put on the back foot in a series like this. I'm not going to freak out yet, though. BLG is a very good team. There is a reason that they are 2-time MSI finalists in the last couple of years, an LPL champion this past split. There is a reason that this team has been to the mountaintop before, and that's because a lot of these players have that gene that just lets them calm down in the middle of some of these series. Unfortunately, that didn't really happen in game number 1. They just kept going for a lot of these aggressive plays because their comp kind of demanded it, and they just didn't really have the gold to be able to pull it off. On is going to get dud of the game. Not a good one for On. He was caught out regularly in this one, just out of position, being way too far forward. Sometimes that's going to happen when you're playing something like Rel and your team is very far behind. There's really not a lot of ways to be able to stabilize that. It's just kind of, it is what it is. It's part of the game. But at the end of the day, some of those engages just needed to be a little bit more tempered. It really felt like he was going in without the approval of his team a lot of the time, especially in the back half of the game. It felt very disconnected, specifically from Wei, who is the other player that kind of has to follow up on a lot of these Rel engages. And so, On is a good player, but this was not a very good showing in game 1. Wei also had quite a few problems problems. The Diana Yasuo did not work. If this was kind of a testing ground for whether or not this duo could work moving forward, it failed. It failed miserably because the Yasuo was doing negative damage, especially in comparison to something like Corki on the other side of this matchup that basically got to do all of the damage for free because there was no way to land any sort of CC on him. And Wei diving in, like, yeah, he was able to get some of the combos off and then Zhonya's up, but he wasn't doing any damage, and also, the moment he comes out of Zhonya's, he dies instantly. Diana is just so fragile that it's really hard to make a diver like her in the current meta work because damage is just so high on the other side of this matchup. You're gonna get blown up. If you get CC'd by the Leona, or even by just like a Zyra ultimate, like, you're doomed. There's no way to survive that if you're a Diana. You have no way to be able to, you know, live that circumstance, and so it just makes it very difficult to play the champion. I thought Elk was fine, Bin was fine. There were moments where they were doing things that were helpful to the team, but again, the Diana Yasuo failed so hard, and On was so out of position in a lot of circumstances that there was just no way for them to be able to win some of these fights. And so for BLG, you just have to go for something, I think, a bit more controlled. I think you tried something out here in game number 1 and it didn't work. Just go to the thing that you know works. You're in the playoffs. This is the time you need to stick to the tried and true. And then for Top Esports on the other side, this was a very good game number 1. About as ideal of a game 1 as you could possibly get. Tian looked great in the early game, and Cream, 369, Mako, they all cleaned up in the late game. This was a very big team performance. And if they can do it again, if they can go up 2-0 in this series, that's ginormous. That would be a ridiculous lead. BLG can win 3 games in a row, but against Top Esports, it's a very tall ask. So a big game 2 here for both of these teams. Who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Bilibili Gaming. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to tie up this series at 1 apiece, and they needed this win. Again, you don't want to go down 0-2 to a team like Top Esports. That's a pretty disaster zone kind of situation for a team like BLG, regardless of how good they are. And so they go back to basics. They go back to the kinds of comps that they have been playing all year long. Kalista plus Renata down in the bot lane, Wei on something a lot more familiar than the Diana, the Sejuani that's able to control the tempo a lot more than Diana, who kind of has to do a lot of these really out there aggressive things. Knight on Corki, where he can just sit back and do a ton of damage for free in these team fights, and Bin on some sort of team fight engager where he's the best top laner in the world in that role. It's just a lot more comfort for BLG across the board, and what do you know it, they were a lot more comfortable in game. It felt like they really had a good idea of where they wanted to be, and I think that was a big turning point for me, where I'm sitting there going like, well, BLG are favorites again for this series because, you know, once they started doing the things they're actually good at, it didn't really seem like they could be stopped in that role. For Top Esports, I think they gave it their best shot. There were a couple of moments that I thought they played pretty well. Tian had another really good game here on the Maokai, which we will talk about, but the rest of the team just not really, you know, measuring up, not living up in that regard. Another crazy R5 pick, this time the Seraphine support. We'll talk about that a bit more. I think it's definitely a lot more understandable going into something like Kalista Renata than like the Diana Yasuo was last game, which was just super risky, but, you know, again, we'll get all to that when we talk about Top Esports. Starting with Bilibili, player of the game for me is going to go to Wei in the jungle. I think On was very impressive, and generally he's going to get a lot of accolades for this game, but you know, his team fighting was great because Renata is really good and because he's pretty good at the champion, not because I think he made any sort of like unbelievable macro reads or plays. I thought Wei's pathing this game was genuinely brilliant. He was always in the right place at the right time, and honestly, I think he deserves more credit for how good he was at setting everybody up in this one. I thought Wei was, in my opinion, by far the most important player on Bilibili, but again, if you wanted to give it to On, I do understand. I just think his positioning wasn't quite as on point. I think Wei did a little bit more to help the overall game for BLG, but both of them were excellent. Elk was excellent in this game. They put a lot of time and effort into the bot lane early on and trying to get this Kalista Renata ahead, obviously into MF Seraphine. You don't really want to try to test the 2v2. You want to take these 3v3s and try to skirmish a ton early, and Wei was actually the one to really make that worthwhile, and obviously that's a credit to him, but it's a credit to Elk as well, who was really, really good in terms of his positioning and just general gameplay this game. His mechanics were on point. He really is great at Kalista, and it's very clear that he's very comfortable on the champion. I want to see him on something like this every game, whether it's Kalista or Misfortune or something that he can play through early on, because as much as, you know, the Zeri and Smolder and things like that are very good right now, I want to see him on something that he can be proactive on early in these games. Kalista just makes so much sense for how this team wants to play. I also want to give a big shout out to Bin in the top lane. Those ultimates were crucial down the stretch on the Kennen. I know people are really low on this champion. Mostly LCK fans are very low on this champion at the moment because it's not performed well in the LCK, but it has here in the LPL. Those ults still do matter a lot. It's just the laning phase that isn't quite as dominant. If you are able to get those ults off in these fights, specifically if the Cassante randomly all-outs you into the middle of his team while you ultimate, like, yeah, that makes it a lot easier to play Kennen. I'll definitely say that, but Knight was good as well. well on the Corki, didn't really make nearly as many mistakes as he did on the Yasuo, but also a much easier champion to pilot. So overall, BLG looking much better now that they are comfortable with the champions that they've drafted. And for top esports, you kind of got taken out of your own comfort zone here. I like that Tion was willing to try to do things early, but you have to recognize where you can and cannot get your advantages. I think investing so much into the bot lane, only for the bot lane to end up losing anyways, was a pretty big disaster for top esports. It basically ruined their entire early game, and I'm not blaming that on Tion, not even really blaming that on Jackie Love and Mako. It just kind of ended up working out like that because the skirmishes went the way that they did. Just a very unfortunate set of circumstances. And then the solo laners just accomplished basically nothing. You had Cream on this Tristana, who was just kind of trying to survive in a lot of these fights. He wanted to play aggressive. You could see that in the way that he was trying to position, but he just didn't really have the resources to be able to do that. And then, as I said, 369, a pretty awful game from him. He's going to get dud of the game pretty obviously for me. You can't really all out Kennen into the middle of your team only for all of them to die in a pretty pivotal Rift Herald fight, and for me not to be like, yeah, that was pretty bad. I think he also played a lot of these skirmishes really poorly. It was just kind of a big difference from game number 1. He was so good in game 1, and he was really not good in game 2. It's just kind of the inconsistency that you've had to live with when it comes to him individually as a player throughout this entire split. I think you could theoretically give this to Cream, and you could give this to Jackie Love as well for being kind of the target of a lot of the aggression from BLG, but I honestly don't think that either of them played as bad mechanically as 369 did in this game, and so it's really up to personal preference, but top esports needs to look better than this. There is some real concern that now that BLG is locked in and actually playing the things that they are good at, the top esports might struggle a lot more in this series. If that is the case, that's going to be a bit of a problem for them. For BLG, you know, if you are able to play your comfort zone and actually just dominate the rest of this series, then it really goes to show just how dominant you actually are domestically. So we'll see how things go. Game 3, as you guys know, when it's tied up 1 apiece like it is right now, to me is the most important game of the entire series. We will have to see how it ends up going, but the winner of game number 3 was Bilibili Gaming. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to go up in this series 2-1, and they have firmly taken control of the direction the series is in moving forward. This was even more dominant than game number 2. This was them from start to finish. You didn't even really get that glimmer of hope where Top Esports was attempting to make plays like they did on the bot side in game number 2. This just was kind of a domination from start to finish, and there really was no way to end up reversing that for TES. Bilibili played about as perfect of a game as you could possibly play. This was kind of similar to their game 1 idea where they wanted to go for a lot of these wombo combos, but man, is it so much easier to execute when this is like Rel ult into bullet time or Gnar ult into bullet time. You know what I mean? Like that, it's so much more replicable in a lot of these circumstances, and with the gold lead that they were able to generate in the early game, it became a lot easier to play out a lot of those mid-game fights. So we'll quickly go ahead and talk about it, but really not a lot to talk about in terms of analysis in this game. Player of the game is going to go to On. You know, I kind of debated giving it to him last game. Broadcast gave it to him both of these games in a row. He definitely deserved it here in game number 3. You can't really have a lot of these combos, these bullet time blow up moments without the Rel going in first and just kind of creating a lot of opportunities. When you give On a go button, likely he's going to be able to just completely take over the game on it. It's not just, oh, On's very good in lane and the 2v2 is really dominant for BLG and that's why they're able to succeed. On is one of the more consistent, engaged teamfight threats in the world. Regardless of position, he just does it at such a high level so consistently. Obviously, people have said that he's like souped up Hillisang. I think that that's a pretty accurate way to go about it. When things work out for On, it looks better than basically anybody else in the world. At times, he has been considered by me to be the best support in the world, certainly throughout times this year. I think they are the best bot lane in the world, and I think we continued to see that here. But we talk a lot about setup. You do have to have payoff to that setup, and Elk was that payoff in this game. He was incredible on the Misfortune. If you are able to set up those bullet times, you do still need to make sure that you have, you know, good angles and that you're not putting yourself in bad positions by doing so, and Elk is just awesome at this champion. I continue to believe that as long as you give him something that can be proactive in the early game, that he's going to be just fine individually as a star. So Elk and On definitely standing out. Wei continues to be awesome in terms of his pathing and just creating opportunities for the rest of this team to take over games and really dominate. He is really good at making the rest of his team look like $1,000,000. That's what he does at a level that Shun wasn't just able to do, right? He's able to, you know, be the facilitator, if you will. I think slowing down the pace was almost a myth in the regular season. It was definitely true during the regular season. Like, I'm not trying to say that they didn't get slower when Wei came in, but clearly that was a conscientious choice and not one that they had to make. They were almost hiding their good moments, as we saw here. Bin was awesome on the Gnar, completely outplayed 369, got that solo kill on the top side. That was brilliant, really beautiful. Knight continues to be really good on Corki. BLG is just really freaking good. This is still one of the best teams in the world. Don't get it twisted. Just because Gen G is so dominant over in the LCK doesn't mean that you should be taking away the accomplishments that BLG are having right now. But the series isn't over. Top Esports, yes, they lost here in game number 3, but they're still alive. What are the things they need to fix, though? Quite a bit, to be entirely honest. This was just kind of a trounce. Tion's gonna get my dud of the game. Really didn't feel good about his performance on the Zyra. This is one of the worst games that he has played in a little while. He's been so consistent in the early game at being able to generate leads, but the problem with Top Esports is that they are so greedy as a team, and most of the time that's actually a huge positive for them because it means they're able to dominate these teams even harder than they normally would. They just refuse to not try to fight over everything. Like, they want to fight over Grubs, they want to fight over Dragons, they want to fight over Heralds. Like, they are just never going to give something up for free, and oftentimes that ends up working out for them because that means when they do have these leads, they're not really giving any avenues for other teams to come back into games. But when you reach situations like this where you are super down in gold, just continuously fighting over and over again means these games end so quickly and you don't really have a ton of options going into the back half. I think Tion is the biggest part of that. He is just really greedy as a jungler, and that's usually been a positive for him. But again, in situations like this where he's playing Zyra and he's really far behind, it is a bit more of a negative. I do want to shout out 369, who continues to be really bad on the top side here in these losses. Has been completely gapping him ever since the game number 1, and so really not good for 369. Mako I thought was pretty bad in this game on the Alistair. He did have to go in quite a bit more than he normally would just because of the general tempo of the game, but he was out of position quite a bit as well. Cream, Jackie Love, they weren't necessarily the issue in this game, but it's not like Ezreal's damage was going to be able to salvage anything, and Cream still got caught like multiple times in side lanes just dying. Like, it's not like he played perfect either. Top Esports just looked completely outmatched in this one. They have to get back to that game 1 form, and honestly, they have to prove to themselves that they can beat BLG when they're not on this weird Diana Yasuo comp. Like, they have to prove that they can beat them when they're on their own comfort. If they can do that in game 4, then anything can really happen in game 5, but BLG certainly wants to close this out in 4 games and show that when they are comfortable, they can do basically anything they want to any top team in the world. Is that going to be the case? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Bilibili Gaming. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to close out this series in 4 games, 3-1, and they have officially moved on not only to the LPL finals, which is obviously big for Bilibili. They want to be considered the champions, but they have officially qualified for the World Championships as well. Even if they do lose in the finals, they will have enough championship points to go as the number 2 seed. So congratulations to BLG. This isn't any sort of particular upset. Nobody is really surprised at all that BLG has qualified. This is kind of the anticipation for this team, but at the end of the day, still getting it done, still making it work. That's the dream. Like, that's the goal, being able to get there through the winners bracket, not dropping a series, like winning the series, quite frankly, so confidently, I think is a really good thing. That being said, let's talk about game 4, because this was a wild one. This was not like games 2 and 3 for BLG. This was not them steamrolling Top Esports and just kind of, you know, beating them and making them roll over and die. Like, Top Esports put up a fight. This was a bloody game, a back and forth one, where both teams actually had quite a bit of advantages and disadvantages. Even the final fight of the game and of the series looked like it was super in favor of Top Esports as they were mounting their comeback, but they just couldn't quite hold on. I saw some people trying to suggest that Top Esports was the one who threw this final game. I think that that is genuinely a ridiculous thing to say. Top Esports did a great job attempting to come back in a game against one of the best teams in the league, and quite frankly, as I've kind of said throughout this series, and honestly how I felt about game 2, I think Top Esports wins this if they're not against Bilibili. Like, genuinely, they were playing really well in the back half. They just made a couple of really tiny errors, and you just can't do that against BLG. You can't do that against 3 of the best players in the world on the other side here. Wei and Elk were very good. Trust me, I'm not trying to undersell them, but Bin, Knight, and On, all 3 of them played out of their minds in this game, and specifically in that final fight, to be able to make it work. A fight that honestly they weren't in a good position to be able to win. They just outskilled them, and it was really fun to watch. Knight is going to get player of the game for game 4. It cannot possibly go to anyone else. He was so dominating on this Corki. He was doing a billion damage every single fight, and if they didn't have him in that final fight, they lose. They lose the fight, and they probably lose the game, to be entirely honest. It starts spiraling out of control, and I don't imagine they're actually able to just kind of dominate and come back in that instance. You have to have a superstar in the mid lane with that Corki, and they had that. Knight really stepping up. I hear a lot of narratives often about him that are, oh, he's bad in the clutch, he's never won Worlds, that must mean he's not actually one of the best players in the world. Like, I just think it's ridiculous, right? This guy's been an MSI Finals MVP, a multiple-time LPL Finals MVP. Just because he hasn't won Worlds doesn't mean this guy can't get it done at the highest level. I think he just needs the team around him, and currently the team around him is pretty freaking good. And so, I think that this has been really solid for him. But player of the series overall is going to go to On in the support position. Just a phenomenal series, specifically on the Rel when he's asked to set up a lot of these engages. That's where he really shines individually in a lot of these late team fights. Not that he was bad at all on the Renata. That was still a really big game for him in game 2, but it is just so different watching him be able to completely change the trajectory of this series by going in and getting 4-man ults basically every single time he needed to in a lot of these pivotal and critical team fights. Bin obviously deserves a lot of shoutouts as well. He was phenomenal in this series. 369 was not nearly as good as Bin was on the other side of this matchup. Clearly a bit of a top gap here, and it's funny, like when these two play, it's often Bin that does come out on top and is looking a lot better individually as a player. I'm not sure if that's something that's like super replicable like forever, but Bin definitely the best top laner in the LPL. I think he asserted that pretty dominantly today. Wei and Elk, like I said, were fine. Like, they weren't bad. Elk got super fed in the early game, but wasn't really allowed to do as much in the late game because he was kind of the target for a lot of this from top esports. If they land the Alistair engage, like Zyra, Cassante, like bullet time combo that they're looking for, then it's probably Ashe who dies because of the lack of mobility, and you just have to live with that. Kind of same thing for Brand. A lot of damage, coming out this game from Wei, but not a lot of survivability. You just kind of have to live with that individual champion. It was really up to Knight, On, and Bin, in my opinion, to carry this game, and they absolutely did. And then for top esports on the other side, you feel pretty bad for them because, again, I don't even think they really played all that bad in this series. I see a lot of people being like, top esports were frauds all along. I can't imagine what it's like to think so black and white all the time. Like, I just can't get in the headspace of being like that. Losing to BLG in some pretty competitive games and being called a fraud, it just feels so interesting to me. Like, I just can't get behind the idea. I understand that there were quite a few mistakes. In particular, we're going to talk about Jackie Love, who did not play this game number 4 all that well, which is a bit surprising to me because Jackie Love, he's kind of a playoff performer. Like, over the course of his career, he's been somebody who's played better the higher the moment is. Obviously, going back to 2018, like, that was very clear there, but in 2019, he kind of was in that similar boat as well. And even going back to a lot of the years here on top esports, like a couple of years ago, like, Jackie Love was the only person on this team that was actively propelling them up near top 4. And so you feel pretty bad that this was just one of those games where he misplayed quite a few times, but the bullet times ended up getting him a lot of kills and a lot of gold, and he just couldn't make the most of it. He ends up flashing in that final team fight in order to Q auto a ward instead of actually getting Bin, who he probably would have killed. But even if he kills Bin, he probably just dies immediately to Knight. It's just over eager, it's over aggressive. We've seen Jackie Love fall into this trap before. It has felt like he's cleaned a lot of that kind of stuff up, but it really came back to bite them in this game. Mako was also not perfect in this series. This definitely was a bit of a support gap. Not that Mako was horrendous or anything like that, but On was truly exceptional, and I've been calling Mako the best support in the world, and he was not nearly as good as On in this series. Certainly something to monitor. 369 was slightly better here, but the Cassante wasn't relevant. Tian wasn't like her perfect, I would say, on the Zyra, but some really good team fighting overall from Tian and Cream. I think when they were able to win, 369 was in a couple of those good ones as well, but Cream in particular, I thought had a really good game number 4. I think with more support around him, he could potentially have had the game that Knight ended up having on the other side of this map, but it just didn't end up working out that way. Top Esports is now sent down into lower bracket. They still have a pretty good shot of being able to, get their way not only into finals, but into Worlds. It would be a pretty big upset if they weren't a team that was in contention for that, but it is certainly not certain depending on who ends up winning that next series. But for BLG, as we've said, congratulations. Welcome to Worlds 2024 Bilibili Gaming. This isn't a big surprise. They're the best team in the LPL as of right now, the number 1 seed, the team that went to the finals at MSI and, won the LPL in the last split. Them going to Worlds is certainly not a surprise, but it's probably nice for them to lock that in regardless of what happens in the finals. If they win it, they go as the 1 seed. If they lose it, they go as the 2 seed. And so they're feeling pretty fine either way, but this is the best team in the LPL, at least until proven otherwise. But then moving on to our second series here and going from winners finals down back to the lower bracket for round number 4. Lower bracket round number 4. The two teams that lost in the upper bracket in round 4 to get us here. And, this is kind of a fraud off if you ask Reddit. I'd like to imagine this more as a very interesting matchup between upper tier teams in the LPL. It's the number 2 seeded LNG Esports taking on the number 4 seeded Weibo Gaming. And again, I don't really see this as like a fraud off. These are two good and not great teams, which is kind of just everyone else in the LPL. I think that there is this idea that, the third or the fourth best team in the LPL has to be as good as the first best team, or even really the second best team. That's never really been the case, and I'm not really sure why the expectation is there. These two teams have earned their spot here, and I genuinely think that they both have been pretty good over the last couple of months. LNG obviously getting that number 2 seed is pretty helped out by a lot of circumstances. Top Esports probably a bit better than them, as they showed in their previous series, but LNG is still one of those teams you have to be scared of in a lot of instances. They have a lot of different win conditions and quite a few players that I think are very good. They only really have one concern for me, and that's that they don't really have a lot of versatility. They're not really this expansive team that has multiple ways that they can win the game. They are very one-dimensional in terms of their playstyle, but that one dimension is very good for them. Being able to play for a lot of these late-game team fights, not necessarily trying to rely on those early-game skirmishes. It's just a more inconsistent style for a lot of teams. A lot can go awry in the early game that might not necessarily be as unpredictable in the later half of the game if you're really good at slowing down the pace, being able to control things and set up for your carries to be able to win fights. Specifically, Scout, who's obviously kind of been the star for this team over the second half. He is the franchise player here for LNG. He's the one that they build around and that they play around. Generally speaking, he is very good in those front-to-back team fights when he's allowed to get to the later half of the game. He's really able to destroy people. Like, when they play around Scout, it looks dangerous. But the problem is that Scout is really not a versatile player, and that really feeds into LNG's problems, is that he's not particularly aggressive in the early game. He's somebody who does just want to kind of sit back and chill and lane and farm up and try to be a resource carry later on. The earlier the skirmishes happen, the worse it ends up being for Scout, which is why him and Weiwei really struggled together at the beginning of the split. But you do have other, quote-unquote conditions. Gala and Hung are obviously really good in the bot lane. They're one of the more consistent bot lanes in the LPL. You really don't get a ton of horrible performances out of them. Gala in particular has really slotted in as being like the quintessential A- player in the world, where you basically know exactly what you're going to get out of him on a game-to-game basis, and it's very good. It might not ever be the best in the world or anything like that, but he's always going to be somewhere around like top 15 or so, and you'll definitely take that if you're LNG. That is more than good enough to be able to win a lot of games with. And then you've got Zika in the top lane. I think he's actually been pretty good over the second half of the summer split. People continue to complain about him as if he's like not a star, because he was kind of a new acquisition for this team from Invictus. They brought him up to try to elevate him in the way that, a lot of these top tier teams have tried to elevate lower tier players like Shun over on Bilibili Gaming, or like Elk on BLG as well, like trying to get these players that have never really been in these top situations to make it work. And I think Zika's been pretty good in that role. I think he's honestly underrated in terms of what he's been able to output. I certainly think he's been better this split than Breathe, his opposition on the other side. But Weiwei is the question mark here, especially because of kind of the storyline going into this. These two junglers obviously playing for the opposite team. Last year, you had Tarzan on LNG, you had Weiwei on Weibo Gaming, both of them arguably finding more success on those previous teams, both trying to figure it out here in their new situations. But Tarzan has been infinitely better than Weiwei over the course of this split. We'll talk about Weibo in a second, but Tarzan is the lifeblood of everything Weibo does. Weiwei has kind of been the weak link on LNG, in my opinion. He's still struggling to try and find a fit into this team. I still don't think he really fits the playstyle. He's a player who really wants to try to skirmish early and often, and that's just not what this team does. They've only gotten better in recent times because he's kind of just taken his foot off the gas and become less important on the team as a whole, which again, I think is fine, but it's really not something that excites me out of this jungle matchup, and I think there is a world where it actually ends up being a pretty big problem, all things considered, for LNG. And so, we'll see. I just want to see what Weiwei ends up doing. If he has a good series, I actually think that could be very in favor of LNG. So that's kind of the scouting report on them, but for Weibo on the other side, it instantly becomes a much more interesting conversation. We already kind of talked about Tarzan. He's been a bit of a star for this team. We'll just say that. He has been definitely the focal point for this team in terms of where they wanted to put a lot of their eggs early game. He is so aggressive. By far the most early game aggressive jungler in the entire league, maybe in the entire world on this patch. He loves to play things like Sejuani and just try to take everything on the map as early as he can do it, really, at the end of the day. Tion is kind of a good comparison for Tarzan. I think they play very differently. Tion likes to be a lot more of a mid-game kind of aggressor, and he wants to not give up anything on the map, whereas Tarzan definitely a lot more focused on that pre-10-minute type of clear. But both of them are very greedy, and I think that's where they get a lot of their similarities. Tarzan has been a massive asset, and if Weibo is going to win this series, likely it's going to be off the back of Tarzan being really good for them. Obviously, the rest of this team has their positives and negatives as well. You can talk about Light and Crisp who have been up and down over the course of this year. Breathe has certainly been up and down. Xiaohu has definitely been up and down. There have been quite a few good and quite a few bad games from him over the course of this year, but Weibo, they've been able to fight their way here because they've gotten together and rallied around a playstyle that they were able to land on. That's why I do think it's fun to see these two teams going head-to-head, and why I do think it's interesting to see which one's going to come out on top, because they both have similar arcs, both struggling a lot early on in the split, going through drastic and radical kind of stylistic changes in the ways that they want to approach the game, and coming out on the other side being better teams for it. And so whoever comes out on top in this series obviously not only gets top 3, but really shows that their improvement was more impactful. My prediction was LNG in this series. I think that they are just a little bit more complete across the board. I really do think this is going to be which one of the main carries ends up getting more fed, though, either Scout or Tarzan. The two former teammates, I think, are going to be kind of the centralizing figures for this series. But the only way to know who ends up taking it is, of course, to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was LNG. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and this was a really decent look for them. I know that feels like such a non sequitur kind of statement to make. Really decent feels like a very weird way to describe the game, but after the early game, they did everything that they were supposed to. This is very on brand for LNG in terms of how they've played out a lot of their games, where they're really not able to do a ton in the early game. You can get a lot of aggression in on them if you are the enemy team, and that's what Tarzan did. He had a great early game on the Nidalee, was basically running everything on the map. But once we got into these key skirmishes, these actual fights, these 3v3s, 4v4s around key objectives in the mid game, LNG is just straight up better and more complete in those areas, or at least they were in this game, and they were able to come out on top because they didn't lose nearly enough in the early game to make that lead something that they would end up losing. This was a very LNG style of win from what we have seen in the regular season, and that should be very encouraging for fans rooting for them. Player of the game is pretty easily going to go to Scout in the mid lane. He was the big damage dealer. We talked about it in the kind of pre-analysis here. Scout is the focal point. He's the centralizing figure of LNG, not only just because he is the franchise player, but because really he is the one determining the pace at which they play the game. When he feels comfortable in the mid game, they can start taking those fights. The moment that he feels he is strong enough to actually start going front to back, that's when everything opens up for LNG, and that's exactly what happened here. Yes, they had to give over some things, specifically some bot lane pressure to the Ashe, to the Nidalee, and then obviously they made some top side pressure as well from the Nidalee. Tarzan had a great early game, but Scout was never individually set behind from that, and once the Corki got online, because the laning phase was actually pretty easy for him into the Yone, all of a sudden it just became infinitely more difficult for Weibo to actually be able to compete in these games. So credit to Scout. I thought his team fighting was excellent. The damage on that champion is ridiculously high when you can play him well, and that's what we saw here. Also, shouts out to Zika and Weiwei. I thought both of them also had pretty decent games. You know, the Kennen sometimes can just get caught out. That champion is just so squishy, and I understand why some people view him as a bit of a bait pick, because he will die very quickly in a lot of these fights, but when it does end up working out, when things go right for this champion, it looks dangerously good, and we saw that with some of the back half engages for him. Weiwei was very good in this game. He was more than willing to cede some of that pressure in the early game and just not really try to fight back. He didn't really feel like he needed to take Tarzan out of that specific comfort zone. He could wait and bide his time to be able to create those engage opportunities later on, and he was able to take advantage, and we'll talk about this, of some Weibo oversteps specifically around that Rift Herald, where Tarzan just jumps into the pit because he feels like he can fight, he feels like he's strong, but they don't have the damage, they don't really have the fighting ability, and Weiwei capitalizes on that, gets on top of the Nidalee, and all of a sudden that lead has evaporated for Weibo Gaming. So Weiwei was a big part of that. Again, I think one of the big developments that LNG has made over the course of this split, one of the reasons this team has gotten more consistent, is because you have a player in Weiwei who has grown in terms of his style. He might not be perfect in terms of this slower paced, more methodical style. It's really not something that he is comfortable on, but he definitely has at least tried to go into that, and I think it worked here. Gala, Hong, they looked good as well, but LNG definitely centralized around Scout and how he wants to play a lot of these fights, and it worked out here in game number 1. And then for Weibo in game number 1, just, it feels frustrating, right? Because you had this situation where it was very winnable. You had Tarzan with a lot of gold in the early game. It felt like Breathe was actually stacking up relatively well on the top side on this R5 Nasus, which can be a very dangerous thing to try to play into. You have an Ashe, a Braum. You have a lot of ways to be able to create in the 5v5s if you are ahead in gold. The problem is you don't really have a great way to transition from one part of your comp into the next part of your comp, especially when Yone really is just not relevant in the game. You have Nidalee to run the early game, and you have Nasus to try to win these like extreme extreme late game fights, but the problem is, like, how do you bridge that gap? And that gap is exactly what LNG was able to take advantage of and get their biggest lead on. Dud of the game is going to go to Zhao, who, like I said, Yone probably solves a lot of those issues, but I have not really seen a more passive Yone game in quite a while. He played so scared, he played so afraid to actually go and try to make a play, and then by the time he did, like, make the call to actually go in a fight and try to do something, he was just getting bursted down instantly by the combination of Vi and Corki, and there was really nothing that he was going to be able to do about it. It's just not a very encouraging game. Xiaohu has definitely been more of a hindrance than he has been a help for Weibo over the course of this year. He has really not been good at all, you know, especially going back to the qualification stage, the first half of the summer regular season. He might have been one of the worst mid laners in the entire region, and so, yes, he's in the top 4 here, and that's great, but Tarzan can't do everything. Like, Nidalee falls apart, especially if he's going to make some mental errors, like just jumping into the pit and dying in the middle of the game. You have someone like Breathe, who, yes, was a bit of a terror down the stretch on the Nasus, but he didn't have enough help in the back half of the game to really make the pick worth it, and it's not like he was doing anything to help gain that lead in the early game because he's Nasus, and that champion can't do anything pre-15 minutes. You have the Ashe, you have the Braum, like I said, but they're not going to be the carries of this game. You were relying so much on trying to get this Nidalee everywhere, and you had it in the palm of your hands and kind of threw it away. LNG was just way more clinical in this game number 1, and if that's going to be the trend that we see, they're going to be able to hold on to this series, but it is just game number 1. If Weibo's able to fight back and tie up the series at 1 apiece, that's going to be a lot better for them, but if LNG can get that 2-0 series lead, you guys know that's ginormous. Having to win 3 games in a row against LNG is not an easy task, regardless of what Reddit would like to make you believe. So, game 2, very important. Who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Weibo Gaming. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to tie up this series at 1 apiece, and we've got ourselves a series on our hands. This is the second series, of course, of this video to go 1-1, and this is what I'm talking about. I don't want any of these blowouts that we saw in round number 4. That was boring. I want these back and forth series that are pretty fun to watch. That being said, this was kind of a blowout of a game. Weibo definitely kind of dominated. They were never really in danger. Really, the big problem that LNG is going to run into in this series is that their early game is really bad, at least in comparison to teams like Weibo, like some of the best teams in the league. Their early games are very suspect. They're such a passive team, and they rely so much on being able to scale into the later parts of the game to be relevant that you land in these situations where if they're down, like, you know, 10k gold at 15 minutes, you're not even really like, what are they doing? It's honestly more expected at this point from a team like Weibo to be able to take advantage of these early game mistakes from LNG. That being said, I don't know how replicable this game is just because it was so bad at level 1, and you get that like 5-minute fight where Jhin ends up getting 2 kills and the game is like over at that point, and so there's really just not a lot you can do. The bot lane just got gapped, but I don't know. The worry for LNG is just that their early game is really that bad. And for Weibo, their early game is really good, and that's their avenue to win a lot of games really consistently in this series. Player of the game is going to go to Light in the bot lane. I think you could give it to either Light or Crisp. It has to go to one of these 2 bot lane members. I give it to Light because I felt like obviously him picking up the kills and getting snowballed out of control is what really made this game unwinnable for LNG, but Crisp is a big reason why he got those kills in the first place, so however you want to end up associating it, they both kind of get half of a player of a game for me if you really want to go down that route. This is a bot lane player of the game, but they just got so fed. Like, the Jhin got snowballed so quickly, and he was doing so much damage throughout this game. I continue to be on the Jhin hype train because this champion just continues to do so much, and really, I think a lot of the people who doubt Jhin see a different version of him than I do. They see this low damage, high utility AD carry, and yes, there are times where Jhin just kind of falls into that role, but the reason he is so reliable as a weak side bot laner is because if he does get like a sliver of gold, he's going to out damage whoever the other ADC is, and that's exactly what happened in this game. He obviously offers that utility regardless of what ends up happening, but it's not like this guy doesn't hurt if you do actually get him rolling, and Light was obliterating a lot of people. He was even stepping up and playing super aggressive in the back half of this game. That was fun to see. You don't always see that out of Jhin players, but it was nice to see. And again, Crisp is awesome. When he's able to play things like Rel and actually be able to engage and set up, it looks amazing. There was a reason last year that I was calling him one of the more underrated players in the entire world, and why I said he was Weibo's best player going into Worlds, and that's because he is able to create angles that other players just don't see. It's the reason he was so successful on FPX for so many years. So Light and Crisp really stepping up here, and Gala and Hong, we'll get to them. They are kind of the rocks of LNG. They're kind of the more versatile, actually, like, can play any style of game types of players, the more, you know, flexible, if you will, in terms of their style, and they kind of got destroyed here, which is a huge negative for LNG. But Zhao, who ends up looking really good in the scoreline and the numbers because he's able to get a bunch of these kills in the back half of the game. He ends up 1v2ing in the final fight to start it off. Like, Corki is just ridiculously broken from ahead. Breed's ultimates were phenomenal in this game. His scoreline looks so bad because, man, they just didn't follow up on them all that well, but he was consistently getting 3 or 4-man Kennen ults on the back of these fights and just didn't have enough damage through the exhaust to be able to actually 1v9, but the team benefited massively from the Kennen. Tarzan was really good on the Maokai. It's one of his better champions. Weibo just looked dominant. They were winning across the board in this one. And that's really all you want to see, especially when you're evening up a series like this. You want to see you play towards your win condition, like understandably playing towards the part of the game that you are just straight up better than, and that's what Weibo did. And then for LNG, again, the concern for this team is just that they are too slow, and I think if you want to kind of pinpoint a way for them to be able to be taken advantage of, it's in these situations where you draft Zeri mid, and you have Gala and Hong actually losing on the bot side. You don't really have anybody else that's going to be able to make up for that. I thought Weiwei tried his best. He was the only player even remotely trying to do anything in the mid game here on the Lilia, and generally speaking, that does track with a lot of the skill sets of these players, but the Zika Ryze in the top lane, I'm not really feeling that. Like, Ryze is a pick that isn't particularly good unless your name is Keen, and then you can probably get away with it because you're so good at the champion. Obviously, Zeri mid is very strong, but going into something like Corki, you're going to lose in the early laning phase. You're not going to be nearly as strong going into the mid game, and then if Corki does just start to snowball, you're never going to be able to catch up to that, and he's going to burst you down instantly, and that's exactly what happened. And again, they rely so much on the MF and the Alistair in this comp, and they just lost. Alistair was horrible. Hong is going to get done of the game, but Gala absolutely deserves this as well, in the same way that Light and Crisp kind of got a co-player of the game. I think Gala and Hong kind of have a co-dud of the game here. This just was a bot lane gap early on in the game. The Misfortune was just not doing anything. Even the bullet times later on in the game weren't all that valuable. It's just not a particularly good performance from LNG, and again, if they want to survive in a series like this, they need to rely on more than just being able to dominate the late game. They have to get there in the first place. Now, it's okay. Like, you don't have to win in the early game. You just can't lose as hard as they did. You can't be going into the mid game down 5k gold. There's really no way to be able to recover that. So I need to see more consistency from the laners here in the early game for LNG. A lot of that starts with the bot lane, and for Weibo, just keep that pressure on. If you're able to dominate the early game like you were here in game 2, that's your pathway to success, because I don't think you're going to be as clinical or as concise in the later half if it is relatively neutral. So big game number 3, you guys know that tied 1-1. I think game 3 becomes the most important game in the series. Establishing that pressure, not having to win both of the final 2 games, it becomes a much easier pathway for whoever wins that third game. So who's going to take it? Well, the winner of game number 3 was LNG. They are going to take game number 3. They are going to go back up in this series 2-1. And again, this is so critical for them to win, to be able to take control of this series and really reestablish dominance in it. That is essential. Not having to win both of the final 2 games, only having to win one of the final 2 games is such an immediate bonus. It's such a cheat code in the final half of the series. Game 3 is just so valuable. And again, if LNG plays like they did in this game, it's not going to go to 5, because this is the exact example of what Weibo can't allow to happen. If LNG is going into the mid game, if they're going into the late game and they have a 3 to 5k gold lead, the game is over. If you are asking Weibo to try to beat LNG in the late game at a gold disadvantage, it's just not going to happen. That's not how these two teams operate. Weibo is so reliant on their early game leads and their ability to be aggressive quickly in games that when they get to those 5v5s or those big end game moments, they need to be able to just kind of out-wallet their opponents, because that's just what they've set up in terms of how they have played over the course of this split. And LNG is basically the opposite. If they are relying on early game leads, well, they're not very aggressive and they're not typically going to get them all that consistently. So when they do get them, when they are going into the mid game with, you know, a 2 or a 3k gold lead and a lot of pressure on the map, it's actually really hard for them to lose, and it's the reason that they've gotten the number 2 seed. They might not be the most exciting team in the world, but when they do get that advantage, it is just so difficult to take it out of their hands. So let's go ahead and talk about how they ended up getting their player of the game. It was so easy. It's gonna go to Zika in the top lane here. What a crazy Ryze game. I was complaining about this pick in game number 2 because it didn't look particularly useful, didn't feel like it was doing damage, and I get that it's supposed to be good in top lane matchups, but I don't feel like it's good into Kennen. I feel like Kennen's a much better champion in terms of the 1v1, and so I don't really know what Rise is supposed to be doing here, but man, did I start to understand the further this game went along. Zeke has clearly been practicing this guy, and, you know, Rise does kind of fit into this idea of off-meta top laner at the current moment with things like Aurora being really popular. I think Rise, like, ironically fills a pretty similar role, although he does it in a much more passive way than a champion like Aurora ends up doing, obviously, but Rise is a very interesting pick because of just the sheer amount of everything that he can do. He can side lane, he can team fight really well, and as we saw in this series, he actually does a boatload of damage. He was really able to take over a lot of these fights. He was by far the most important player in this game, and he was really the one who propelled LNG to this win, but I would be remiss not to mention Scout. I thought he was really good in this game on the Tristana. Again, when he gets a lead and is actually able to team fight in the late game, he can be so aggro in these 5v5s and be like such a main character type of carry, but it's just really hard for him to get there because he isn't a very good early game laner. And so you end up in these situations where oftentimes he's going into the late game with a bit of a gold deficit unless the team is babying him, which they tend to do. That's their win condition, as I've stated. But Xiaohu, on the other side, he's not a good laner either. And so you end up in these situations where Scout accidentally is able to come out of these early games with a gold lead, and then it's kind of over for Weibo. Weibo was pretty good. The Ivern is just such a strong pick. We've seen this globally. Anybody who can play him at an even remotely passable level ends up dominating. Gala and Hong were significantly better here in Game 3. They just need to not get destroyed in the bot lane 2v2. That's really all you're asking from the two. Not that they can't do better than that, but I mean, the floor is pretty high for what they need to accomplish. Overall, LNG, just a much more clinical game. Again, if you go into these late game 5v5s with the gold lead as LNG, they're just not going to lose that. They're too good in that stage of the game. You need to be able to attack their weaknesses, and that's not what Weibo Gaming did here. Breathe is a pretty easy choice, in my opinion, for dud of the game. The Kennen was useless. I think the Kennen should be good into Rise. Theoretically, this isn't even all that bad of a matchup. He should be relatively good in the team fights and much more of an impact even through the exhaust, just purely from the threat of having to focus on the Kennen at the start of a lot of these fights. It should open up more opportunities for things like the Zeri and the Rel and the Maokai to be able to create for the rest of the team, but that's just not how it ended up happening. Breathe was significantly worse here in Game 3 than he was in Game 2. Even in Game 2, he was already struggling to do damage because exhaust is just such a hard counter to Kennen, but he was at least getting himself in good positions to be able to set up the enemy team to force themselves to react to him. But in Game 3, he wasn't even doing that. He was going in and instantly dying in a lot of these circumstances. It just was a bad game from Breathe. He was entirely useless. I think the other player that I considered here was Tarzan for dead of the game. The Maokai just didn't really work here. I understand the idea of it, but again, you're so focused on these late game fights where LNG is already at their strongest. You need to be locking in terms of trying to get that lead in the early game and establishing that pressure pre-10 minutes. That should be Tarzan's goal because that's been his MO over the course of this split. That has been the thing that he has done that has gotten him on the All-Pro list. And so to completely change up styles, I get he's a great Maokai player. We talk about this all the time. He is arguably the best tank jungler player in the world in terms of just raw understanding of where to be at and how to play a lot of these team fights out. But this team just doesn't function unless Tarzan is doing something in the early game. They are entirely dependent on his ability to actually play fast. And so if you're playing Maokai, you land in these situations where not enough is happening on the map. There are just things that need to be fixed for Weibo. They need to do it now. They are one game away from being eliminated here in the playoffs. They have to win game number 4. If they can, that's a big momentum booster, but LNG certainly wants to close this out in 4 games and not bring us to a Silver Scrapes game number 5. So, is LNG going to close out this series, or is Weibo going to tie us up and send us to that game 5? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Weibo Gaming. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to tie up the series at 2 apiece, and we are going to a Silver Scrapes game number 5 in this elimination playoff series. Big one here for both of these teams, obviously, but a massive win for Weibo, and this was not an easy win. This was not one of those games that they just kind of cruised to a victory where they were kind of dominating in the same way that game 2 was, or even game 3 was in favor of LNG. This was the closest and most back and forth game of the series up until this point, both of them playing with their playoff lives on the line. It's just It's crazy stuff. You can tell the urgency in this game, and Weibo was just unfortunately the one that came in more clutch towards the back half, and there are two players in particular that I think are really big in terms of being able to get them over that hump. The first one is my player of the game, Breathe, in the top lane. You know, I've been pretty critical of Breathe. I do not think he's been nearly as good as you would expect a player like Breathe to be so far on Weibo Gaming. I think he's had a lot of ups and downs, and that's not really what I would have expected from a player of that caliber. I don't want ups and downs from Breathe. I want him to be one of the better top laners in the LPL. Luckily, he seems to be settling in. I mean, I say that. It's not like he was particularly good in the previous game, but the good games are definitely still there. And if you can get him into these situations where he can play Cassante and just not really have to think about a ton in the later half of the game, he can still pilot that champion at a really high level, and he can still play a lot of these circumstances at a really high level, even with his opposition playing well. And he was able to pick up a solo kill on Zika. Zika, who's been really good over the past couple of games. It was really important to be able to kind of establish pressure in that 1v1 matchup, and to be able to just kind of pick up some gold and really establish some tempo on the top side of the map for the team. Again, it's indescribably important for that to be able to be an option for Weibo Gaming, and that's exactly why it was so big for Breathe to play the way that he did. But the other player to shout out, Xiaohu in the mid lane, who I thought had an excellent game, like truly an unbelievably good game on the Lucian. Maybe you can criticize some of the cullings and some of the later team fights, but early laning phase, entirely Xiaohu. He played that basically perfectly outside of getting 3-manned, like at level 3 or whatever he got 5 minutes into the game. You know, that was unfortunate, but he gets a kill in a 2v1 in another gank in the mid lane, and he's able to completely take over some of these fights to really set Weibo up in an actually a pretty good position in the mid game. And without that, I really don't think they're able to win this game. I think Xiaohu is going to go a bit under the radar for just how important he was. His team fighting was actually really good as well. Again, the culling sometimes looked a little bit sus, but generally the actual damage he was putting out in those fights was more than important enough to be able to get them across the finish line. Light, Tarzan, they both kind of did their jobs. Tarzan was doing 1 billion damage at the end of this game, but most of that was just Brand being a good champion and less of it feeling like, you know, Tarzan actually playing well, more so just like, wow, Brand is really broken. And then you've got Light on the Varus, you know, fine game. I don't think he did anything particularly impressive. He mistimed some of the ultimates that actually became a bit consequential down the stretch on things like Zika's GA, so that's not ideal, but the damage was obviously very good. It's very easy to play the front to back here if you're Varus, and the comp is actually relatively strong, but Dud of the game is actually going to stay on the winning side here. It's going to go to Crisp in the support position. Just a weird game from Crisp, because there were some team fights that were very influential from the Leona, but then there were also a ton of moments throughout this game where he's just way too far forward, where he's stepping up and trying to greed. Like he tried to stop a back after a 1-dragon team fight and just like way overextended and died for no reason after Weibo had just gotten so much pressure and so much gold. He missed a couple of ultimates throughout this game that I thought were pretty influential. Again, you can't look at every fight and see a problem with Crisp. It's not like he completely ran it or anything like that, but especially because, as we'll get to, LNG really didn't play this game bad at all. They tried a lot of things, and yeah, they made a couple of individual mistakes, which we'll talk about, but for the most part, they were pretty good. Dud of the game was kind of hard to come by, and Crisp, unfortunately, because of some of those mistakes, is going to grab that, but again, Weibo looking importantly good. Like, they had to win this. Again, they are out of the playoffs if they lose this, and so big win for them. An unfortunate loss for LNG. Obviously, going to 5, it's not the worst thing in the world. You know you can win a game against Weibo Gaming. You've already won 2, but this game was winnable for you, and you just weren't able to be clutch enough in the end. I think people are going to point to Gala and some of his mispositioning down the stretch of this game as a big problem for LNG. I'm certainly not taking that into account, but the Ezreal was pretty good for a majority of the game, and so I can't quite give him dud of the game, even if he did make some critical mistakes down the stretch, very out of character mistakes for Gala. But I do want to give a shout out to the solo laners who also played well. We talked about the solo laners on Weibo kind of being the driving force for Weibo Gaming. Zika was the creator, the problem in the late game for Weibo to try and solve. Obviously, Renekton, it's kind of difficult to 1v9 on that champion in a lot of these fights, but he did everything he was supposed to do outside of getting solo killed on the top side. This was just a strong game and a pretty strong series from him. I think Scout was also really good in this game on the Azir. Got a lot of tempo and pressure in the early game, and a lot of that was kind of donated to him by his teammates, but, you know, getting that is still incredibly important for him, and so to be able to see him get it and then capitalize on it, again, very big. I thought Weiwei, Hong, they were good as well, and then Gala was good up until the end of the game. But LNG, again, I hate to stress on this so much. It feels like I've said it in every single game recap, but the story is the same. They just need to be able to get to these situations where they're not losing in gold a ton, even though this game went late. It went 40 minutes. LNG was never really in a spot where they were getting to play from neutral. They almost came back at times. They won a couple of fights at negative gold advantages, but Weibo was just better in terms of the macro, and so they never were able to get to these front-to-backs that Maokai, Azir, Ezreal comps want to create for them. If they can do that, if they can get to those front-to-backs neutral in the later half of the game, they are likely just going to be able to win them, and so that has to be the game plan, but Weibo doing a good job to try to negate that. This is an incredibly important game number 5. Of course, neither of these teams' years are done after losing this, but both of them feel like they can probably at least try to get to the finals with a victory here. So a massive silver scrapes coming in. Who's going to be able to take the series? Well, the winner of game number 5 was Weibo Gaming. They are gonna take game number 5. They are going to win this series 3-2, and they will be moving on to the LPL semi-finals. A magnificent result for a team that I think everybody had been counting out for a majority of this split. There were moments and times where they looked like complete goners. The Group D version of Weibo Gaming, they barely made it into Group Ascend to begin with. They were a team that at times looked worse than Ultra Prime, who was a disaster in Group Nirvana later on in the split. And so for that team to be able to get things together and get themselves into the top 3 to make semifinals at the very least and give themselves a ton of championship points, that is massive. This result also has pretty massive implications on the regional qualifiers. That we will touch upon a bit more at the end of the video after we talk about this series later on in the outro. But let's talk about Game 5, because this is definitely a bit disappointing for LNG. This is not the kind of game you want to go out in the playoffs on. A lot of people are really concerned about whether or not this team is legit, and while I do believe this series had a ton of positives to take away from it for LNG, casuals are going to look at this and see a loss, see 2 series losses back-to-back against Top Esports and Weibo Gaming, and really start to believe that this team does not have the juice in order to get to Worlds, and that's definitely something that could be concerning going forward. So we'll talk about that. You know, I don't think it's quite that black and white, as it basically never is when it comes to League of Legends, but for Weibo Gaming, what a great way to end the series. After coming back from a 2-1 deficit, you are able to close out and kind of dominate this game number 5. It was definitely more of a standard game. The Renekton Italy never really fails Danny in game number 5, and you just have to give him a lot of confidence, or give him a lot of thumbs up for the confidence he has in this draft that he basically pulls out every single time they need an important one. Tarzan is going to get player of the game, and maybe controversially, he's actually going to get my player of the series as well. I don't know how popular of an opinion that is, but quite frankly, I don't really know who to give it to on the side of Weibo Gaming. I don't think anybody in particular dominated. Like, I don't think there was one player that, like, oh, Weibo couldn't have won without them. I think Tarzan is just generally the most important player on Weibo Gaming in terms of how they play the game, and so he is player of the series most of the time when they play these games. But if you wanted to give it to someone like Light, I think he's really the other person that I really considered. Light had a really good game. He just kind of followed up mostly on the things that were being created for him. Now, that's a really valuable trait to have. He's not making mistakes. He's not really putting himself in bad positions, which is obviously a bit rare on this team, quite frankly. But Tarzan is the one that is creating a lot of those opportunities. So for me, he's player of the game. He's player of the series. And Tarzan really is the heart and soul of Weibo Gaming. This team is most certainly not sitting in 3rd place without Tarzan. And I'm really intrigued in that semifinal matchup, that jungle matchup, Tian, Tarzan. I think that's going to be a blast to preview later on in the video, and of course in the semifinals video that comes out in a couple of days. But I want to give a big shout out to Breathe as well. This guy was pretty bad in game number 3, but outside of that, you can look at a lot of positives for him. Game 2, Game 4, Game 5, the 3 wins for Weibo Gaming. I thought he was very important in all of those, specifically in that game number 4 win. So credit to Breathe. He just needs to be stable enough for this team to be able to win around him. Of course, he's able to do that, but you know, it's good to see it happen. Crisp was also much better than he was in game number 4, where he was a bit of a liability, even in their win. You know, Xiaohu, I thought, was definitely better down the stretch of this series, but this was a team effort from Weibo. This is them understanding, again, their win condition. I hate to make it so obvious, but it really is kind of obvious. It's them understanding that their win condition is winning the early game and then being able to snowball out of control and just doing that. You know, getting gold on Light, getting gold on Tarzan, getting gold on Xiaohu, and just making it really difficult for LNG to be able to play out the mid game. That's what they did, and they did it well. For LNG, Again, they just didn't have the playstyle to be able to match up well against a team like Weibo. I think this is a pretty bad matchup for them. I probably should have talked about that a bit more in the preview, but hindsight's 2020, right? It looks like a bad matchup because they ended up losing it. But I think it's worth noting this team won 2 games in this series for a reason. They didn't get slaughtered or stomped, and quite frankly, there was a real chance for them to win Game 4. They were down gold that entire game and continued to fight back over and over again and keep the game alive and keep the game close when it really shouldn't have been. And so all these people that are sitting here and talking about LNG as if there's some team that clearly did not deserve to be in the top 4. I feel like, again, it's just such a black and white way of looking at it. It's LNG lost, that means they're bad, and that means they're frauds, without actually trying to analyze what went right and what went wrong for the team. There is a lot of problems here, and there is a real chance that this is not a Worlds team. I'm not even going to entirely disagree with that narrative, but to say that all of it is just good or all of it is bad, it's just not really the way that League of Legends works out. The things that they do well, these late game fights, if they are able to get Scout into a good position to be able to blow the game up on Corki, he would have been able to do that. If this game was actually like within reach for LNG, then I think they actually have a chance to win it because that's their skill set, but the game wasn't in reach, and what they need to work on and what ultimately might be their downfall and what might keep them out of Worlds is that they're just not very good in lane. Every single one of these lanes ended up losing 1v1 or 2v2. Top lane got destroyed. Mid lane got destroyed. Bot lane, this whole series got destroyed. Hong is going to get dud of the game. Hong was not very good in this series. Gala was not very good in this series. They are kind of the rocks, the focal points, I guess if you will, of LNG's security. Like, Scout is the one who needs to step up in order for them to win games, but you can rely on Gala and Hong typically to be the ones that are stable on the bottom side of the map. That didn't happen in this series, and if that's going to be a problem for them in these major series, then that is not something that is going to be easily fixable for LNG as a whole. I already think Weiwei is a bit of a problem stylistically with the rest of this team. Zika obviously can be a bit exposed, but generally speaking, he was their best player in this series, but it's really up to the bot lane. They have to be good enough in order to be at the very least like a top 3 or a top 4 bot lane in the region. People are talking about Gala so highly. I left him off of my all-pro list because, again, I just thought there were 3 better AD carries, and unfortunately, that is aging kind of well because he's just not playing well in the playoffs right now, which is a bit disappointing. But again, for LNG, we will have to see what ends up happening to them moving forward. I'm not going to sit here and say this team is definitely going to make the World Championship or definitely not going to make the World Championship. I can't make that claim right now. They have clear strengths and clear weaknesses, and it's all going to be about whether or not they can get those strengths out against other teams like a Ninjas in Pajamas or a JD Gaming, and whether or not those strengths or those weaknesses can be exploited by those other teams, and whether those weaknesses are big enough to, take away basically all of the strengths. That is yet to be determined. At least for now, there is still hope. You don't win 2 games accidentally against Weibo Gaming, but I'm sure they're going to be disappointed by their loss. And for Weibo, you've just got to be excited. They are moving on to top 3. This certainly makes things interesting. Again, I will talk about that a bit more at the end of the video. This is definitely the more intriguing outcome in terms of the results for the rest of this playoff run, but Weibo kind of really asserting that fraud label most certainly outdated at this point. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LPL Winners Finals Lower Bracket Round 4 overview and analysis video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. Up on the screen, the updated bracket. 3 teams remain in the LPL Summer Split Playoffs. Bilibili Gaming punching their ticket not only to Worlds, but of course to the LPL Finals with that win in Winners Finals. Top Esports moving down into the lower bracket to now meet Weibo Gaming, who picked up that win over LNG. Our semifinals are in a couple hours as of me recording this video, and so I'm really excited to preview this very quickly. Top Esports taking on Weibo Gaming, obviously the matchup to watch. Tion taking on Tarzan. This is really where a lot of the eyes are going to be, and I think if one of those junglers can get a massive early game lead, that's going to be the series. Both of these teams are incredibly aggressive. I think Top Esports is maybe the most aggressive team. Weibo Gaming probably the most aggressive player in Tarzan. So again, I think whichever team is able to really snowball these games, that's kind of the game plan for both of them. I would expect Top Esports to just kind of be better between these two. I would be kind of surprised if Weibo was able to come out on top, but the reason that this series is so intriguing is because it doesn't actually determine Worlds qualification quite yet. I know that feels kind of strange, but that's a nice transition into our regional finals. Up on the screen, of course, the regional finals bracket. With their loss, LNG does enter the regional qualifiers. Of course, JDG Ninjas in Pajamas had already qualified because of championship points and because of the way the other teams ended up finishing. LNG slots into that number 4 spot, but that number 3 spot, Still up for grabs. Of course, it's going to be either Top Esports or Weibo because Bilibili has qualified for Worlds, but it's not quite as simple as who wins the semifinals, because even if Weibo Gaming wins the semifinals, if they go to the finals and lose, they still have less championship points than Top Esports. If Bilibili beats Weibo Gaming in the finals, Top Esports will still qualify for Worlds as the second seed, and Weibo will still have to go through the regional qualifiers. So this is very likely Weibo Gaming, even if they beat Top Esports in the semifinals, which is already a big upset. Kind of, unfortunate how that ends up working out for them, but I guess that's the jig if you're not good in spring, right? You have to be good all year long. All of this is obviously made a lot easier if Top Esports ends up winning, but the only way for Weibo Gaming to avoid the regional qualifier is to win the LPL. They have to do that in order to avoid it, or else they will be going into the regional qualifier regardless of where they go out with the rest of the tournament. So at least some intrigue in the rest of this. It's not just BLG and Top Esports locked. Weibo Gaming definitely still has a chance, but it is a much more minor one than if LNG were to win. Of course, if LNG would have won that series against Weibo, if they then would have beaten Top Esports, they would have more championship points because they finished better in the spring split. You get how it goes. And so, it's just kind of funny how it ends up going down, but that is the video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know if you agree or disagree with my takes, and let me know if you agree or disagree with Top Esports being big favorites over Weibo. Would love to know your thoughts and opinions on that down in the comment section below. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we're going to be covering the rest of the LPL season, the rest of the playoffs, the regional qualifiers, all that fun stuff, but of course, we will also be covering all 4 of the major regions as well: LCS, LEC, and the LCK. The playoffs are rocking and rolling. We also cover the NACL, Tier 2 over in North America. So if you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all